And I hope you all had terrific discussions and conversations during lunch. It's my pleasure to kick off our afternoon by introducing the moderator for our panel. George Serafin has been a longtime partner of the Case for Quality and a terrific partner for NDIC. And we missed you at the March Forum, so we're happy to have you back.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Much appreciated. We're going to get Robin up here, too. I think she's just outside talking. Maybe you could just grab her quickly. Oh, that'd be great. But first, just to comment, I know it's just after lunch. Everybody's sitting down. We had, I thought, a fantastic session this morning and a lot of tremendous energy. So certainly, I take that responsibility along with the panel to now move us into the afternoon, sustain the energy up. And what we're doing. We have a fantastic panel discussion here for you today to really go down around the value proposition around the voluntary program and really hearing it from a variety of perspectives around the ecosystem. So to start, I thought, we heard it before, that it's all about the patient. We heard that as a consistent theme. So Cindy, starting with you, around from a patient perspective, what information is really important from a patient perspective?
Well, thanks so much. And thanks for inviting me to speak today. I'm Cindy Grossman, and I represent an organization called Faster Cures. And we are here in D.C. We're a think tank, a center of the Milken Institute. And I just want to clarify that I'll tell you what we are in a minute, but let me just tell you what we're not. We're not a patient organization. We work with patient organizations. In fact, we work with over nearly 100 of them across diseases and conditions. And what we are really aim to do, we've been around for about 15 years, and our aim is really to help speed medical product development and care delivery in service to patients, getting treatments and cures to patients faster. And we work with all the stakeholders in the ecosystem across the system to accomplish that goal. In fact, we have sort of 3 areas that we work in. We work a lot in policy, so the PDUFA negotiations and authorizing legislation, as well as in 21st century. We were a big proponent of 21st Century Cures Act. We work in biomedical collaboration, and then a program that I head up is called Patients Count. And it's to get the science of patient input. It's really to help build out some of the methodologies needed to collect the information from patients and use it in decision-making in a reliable and effective way to benefit patients. And we basically have been working to create this program to really build out the methods and to bring together multi-stakeholders to do that. Now, there's different levels of opportunities, and I don't want to make any assumptions about what you all know about what's happening kind of in the patient engagement movement, but it is a movement, it is a thing, and you all clearly have drunk the Kool-Aid or we're already there. But just to say that there are a number of different levels that patients can be and want to be engaged in the effort. And so obviously they can be engaged in the governing council, and we've heard that at the NEST. Our colleague Mark Booten from the National Health Council is part of that governing council, Sharon Terry, others that we work with closely. My area is actually sort of more in the brass tacks of collecting data from individual patients and trying to help that data both feed back to them for decision making, but also be used more effectively in the system. So for example, I head up a program in patient reported outcomes and also a lot in the area of patient generated health information and data sharing. So the discussion this morning about real world evidence was really interesting. But just to answer your questions more specifically, what do patients want for the information that is collected from them and how do they want to use it? I'll highlight 3 things. And it's not just sort of, I think anybody can envision yourself being a patient. Perhaps a lot of you are patients. If you've probably ever been to the doctor, technically you're a patient. And so you can kind of imagine what you would want to do with that information, how you see that information being used. But there are sort of 3 main levels that I want to highlight. One, patients want engagement, and they want it to be meaningful to them. They want to participate. And so there's a number of different ways in which patients are participating. And in particular, on some of the cutting edge stuff that was discussed today in terms of defining quality and defining value. So patients can help be at the table to define those things, and we would argue that they really should be at the table to help define those things. In the area, for example, of patient-reported outcomes or outcomes that matter to patients, we're involved with an effort through the Diatribe Foundation to try to think about, and they're involved in a multi-stakeholder effort to involve outcomes beyond A1C levels, for example, for diabetic patients. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for patient organizations and individual patients to participate to define the value and quality metrics that everybody wants to use. The second thing that patients want is greater transparency. And we see that a lot in terms of trying to say, okay, who do patients trust? Well, they trust their doctor. We have some great survey data, and others have done great work on demonstrating that they trust doctors. Caregivers trust patient organizations as well as physicians. And then the kind of trust erodes. The farther you get in terms of the system, the more trust we are trying to explore is we think that one of the reasons that erodes is because transparency erodes. It's not so much that those are bad actors, hospitals or other organizations, it's that the level of transparency, what they understand about what the data is, what data is being collected and how it's being used becomes less clear to them. And so why would you trust a black box that you can't sort of understand what's going on inside of it? And so I think that's one thing that there's a lot of work that can be done. But I think we have a particular effort. We're working with Avalier to develop a patient perspective value framework where we take some of the data generated from patients, including some of their individual costs for their medical care, and try to think about how to put that into existing value frameworks in terms of how to use the information that matters to patients and to make those kinds of determinations. And the third area, and then I'll close, is just patients want to use data, and they already are using a lot of data for shared decision-making and for self-management. And you're only going to see that grow, right, as the apps and wearables and other kinds of technologies allow them to participate and to take more ownership and charge of their own health. And so I think they expect a dialogue with some of those companies and organizations, and those technologies are already talking to us. My phone talks to me. I have a relationship with Google. It is very personal. So you know, how are your organizations going to think about, and how can the kind of case for quality things that you're doing that are so innovative speak to hitting those areas of engaging at the individual level and also at the system level, creating greater transparency for so patients can be involved and patient organizations can participate. And then the final thing, sorry, just one more thing to let you all know about is that the National Health Council is creating training tools to help patients engage in quality discussions and trying to define quality. And there's a number of these kind of training programs for patient organizations. And so if interacting with individual patients, which I'm sure you all do through your own programs, is already happening, I also encourage you to go at the organizational level to try to think at which patient groups are in this space, because they're just getting ever more savvy and ever more participatory in terms of educating patients on ways they can be involved.
Yeah, Cindy, thank you very much. Very insightful. Any other thoughts from the panel to build on what Cindy was talking about? Sure, Nathan. And just FYI, we drafted Nathan at the last minute, so thanks for.
Yeah, this isn't a real thing. I just thought this
real
was
time.
Great. I got bored of sitting over there. No, you know, I'd probably take it just a little bit different direction. I think the perfect medical device is the one that's not seen. It returns the patient to the state of normal or better. It's one that is not something that the patient has to think about or worry about. There's a lot of places where we're seeing patients are taking a much more active role in selecting the device that they want, and they want information up front when they're in that disease state. But after they've been treated, it seems like really they don't want to think about it. They want to get back to life at the level or better than their normal would have set them. And the reason I think about that is, you know, we talked a little bit about the SAPIEN 3 device. It's an artificial heart valve that gets blown over a failing valve, essentially. And I had the opportunity to be in the waiting room with my grandmother as she was getting that. And the only thing that we were thinking about was returning her to normal, was having her be able to walk out without having shortness of breath, without having challenges of basic care. And that seems to be, you know, from my perspective, what I think patients expect from us. They want that to be, they don't want to have it as a permanent part of their life. They want their life to be back to their normal.
Yeah, well said. Thank you, Nathan. Mike, I want to turn to you. I mean, you and I have been on this journey from the beginning. Why is this program important to you? Why have you invested your time in this program, and what are the hospitals? What are the hospitals interested in with respect to this program?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, George. So from a healthcare perspective, just give a little bit of background. Excuse me. I come from the hospital environment as a supply chain professional, so I bring that real-world expertise to our association arm, which represents supply chain professionals either within the hospital setting or across the supplier GPO setting. But I can tell you, healthcare and the healthcare supply chain, it continues to evolve. A few years ago, not too long ago, the focus had solely been cost. Right? We were tasked, cut 20% out of the budget, sign more GPO contracts, negotiate lower pricing, which is a bit of a myopic view and approach for a supply chain professional. What we're promoting now and what you're seeing begin to take hold here when you're looking at a value-based reimbursement or quality-based reimbursement model is cost being one variable, not the sole variable. Cost is now being looked at in conjunction with quality. What's the quality of the product? What's the patient satisfaction? What's the patient outcome? What's the patient experience? Value-based purchasing is how hospitals are being graded, if you will, on their performance in a couple of key areas, and one of those is patient satisfaction. Is the product that we're bringing in-house, is it actually improving the patient life, the patient experience? Are we reducing the length of stay? Are we eliminating or reducing readmissions? So quality measures are really important to take in conjunction with the cost. And then from a cost-quality outcomes perspective, it's a movement that ARM has been championing for the last few years. Outcomes from our perspective is how healthcare organizations are now being reimbursed. Right? They're being reimbursed on the value that they bring to the patient, on the outcomes, not the typical fee-for-service model. So when you look at quality in conjunction with outcomes and you add cost into that equation, we're really, that's the entire cost equation. That's the total cost of ownership. So key to that is the supplier-provider relationship. And up to this point in time, it's been a bit contentious, I'm sorry to say. Really, there's not a tremendous amount of trust that's there, which is unfortunate because in other industries where you see a trust relationship between the provider and the supplier, you see a lot more advances, you see a lot more collaboration, you see improved outcomes. So that is something that we're moving towards within the healthcare field, and we need to continue to move in that direction, George. You talked about transparency, Cindy. We need transparency if providers and suppliers are really to engage in a trusting relationship. There needs to be transparency. You need to be building strategic relationships up at the C-suite and then further on down the ranks. You need to really align both of the organizations. And I want to just make sure that this point doesn't get lost. I'm being very intentional in using the word supplier because the other term that we typically will say is vendor. Well, a vendor is somebody I purchase from. It's a transactional relationship. I'm purchasing a product or I'm purchasing a service. Supplier is somebody that I am engaged with strategically. It moves beyond the transactional relationship. So when you begin to look at the move to value-based care, value-based reimbursement, we actually need to be working together because at the end of the day, it was said earlier this morning, it's all about the patient. We are all here because of the patient. So for really to see the changes that we want to see, we need to begin to work together to look at each other as a part of the solution as opposed to a part of the problem.
No, thank you, Mike. Now, I know later the outcomes team will give their update on activities, but building on the transparency point that you made, could you share a bit of thoughts around the quality dashboard? And in terms of what the hospital is looking for that, and again, how does that tie to some of the work we did in the pilot the past year?
Sure. So, Dan, this means that you're going to have to talk longer when we give our presentation. That's a great question. I think it comes down to unbiased data. Right now, the concern that we've heard from our value analysis partners that are a part of the analytics team is the lack of unbiased information out there for them to review. At the end of the day, healthcare professionals, physicians, clinicians, supply chain professionals are utilizing real-world data, real-world evidence, we've heard that term this morning a number of times, to guide our strategic sourcing decisions. But that data really needs to be unbiased. It needs to be multiple sources of data coming into a dashboard that's fairly easy to use. Our model from the start, George, as you'll remember, was to develop a consumer reports-like dashboard that doesn't state this is the product to purchase. Rather, it provides information for these highly educated healthcare professionals to assess and determine what is the best product based on the population that we're managing and the population that we care for. So, and it needs to be unbiased, it needs to be consistent, it needs to be reliable. And so one of the other challenges that we found in phase one of the project was lack of standardized data. A lot of it's unstructured, and it's really bringing a standardized model to the data sets that are out there that are existing in the world today so that we can much more easily begin to overlay analytics on the top of that information and then drive that information or utilize that information to, again, help guide the strategic procurement decisions that are being made every day in the hospital setting.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that. So let's turn our attention, now we've been doing this outside-in kind of approach, let's now talk to the manufacturers. And it's great because we've got a perspective from a PMA viewpoint, from a 510K viewpoint, and also, encourage the panelists also to talk about the perspective from a small, medium, and large in terms of organizations. But starting with you, Luann, what do you see as the value of the voluntary program, and then also how would you communicate that value within your organization to your executive committee as well as to your organization?
Well, first of all, I'll comment going after the things that both Mike and Cindy have said. When we turn to a world where we're paying for quality versus paying for service in healthcare, it ups the game from a manufacturing perspective. We must have high quality. Medtronic has a program, we call it value-based healthcare, and I'll just give you a quick review of it. We are saying to the patients, we will be accountable for the outcome. We have an anti-infective envelope that's used with implanted devices, and when that is used, we are going into a risk-sharing plan with the provider to say there will not be an infection in that patient. And if there is an infection, Medtronic is accountable for that, okay? So we're putting it right on the line. In our diabetes pumps, we are saying when you follow this treatment regimen using the product, you will not have a problem with your diabetes. And so Medtronic is saying we're going to do that. That kind of scares me as the head of quality for the company because that means that that device must work. And so one of the reasons why the voluntary program is so important for us today, for everyone in this room today, is because the bar has been raised. And it's not about compliance. The bar has been raised around quality. And so when we think about a simple change that will occur, when CMMI is coming in and assessing the maturity of our quality system, the capability of our system to produce high quality, high reliability every single day, it's a totally different way of looking at what we do. It turns it completely upside down. When the investigator comes to our front door, they're not saying, I know something's wrong and I'm going to find it. The assessor is coming in to say, let me see how good you are. And it's a totally different game. When we prepare for the CMMI inspection versus an FDA inspection, it will be a very, very different dynamic that goes on. And I want to know what is the maturity of the quality system, because I need to know how likely we are to succeed in producing that product later on. So I welcome it. Another reason why I welcome it is because as we participate, as we all participate, we will learn from each other what works and what doesn't work, what matters from a product quality perspective. Now, the patients in the hospitals, they probably don't care that the inner diameter of the catheter into the sleeve is blah, 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 blah. I mean, that is our quality measure, and we say we did a good job because we met that quality measure. But if the physician can't use the product in a seamless way, get the patient off the table, up and walking, that's what matters. And so with the CMMI model, sharing the information that we all have, we will all learn what really matters. And we'll stop doing stuff that doesn't make sense, and we'll start doing the stuff that truly delivers in terms of a value. And then the third piece is, Robin mentioned trust. I don't know, someone counted. Who counted the number of times Robin mentioned trust? Many, many times. We need to trust each other. We need to be worthy of the trust of the regulators, of the providers, of the payers, of the patients. We need to be worthy of that trust. And I believe that the voluntary program will get us to a point where I can say, my facility is worthy of that trust. If it's the housekeeping seal of approval, or if it's a stamp on a sheet of paper that goes, I believe that goes a long way. And then finally, I want to touch on the psychological piece of this. When I think about, what do you think when you think FDA's here? Your heart starts pounding, you're like, oh my God, what's going to happen? But think of it, CMMI, you guys would be happy, this is good for you. CMMI is here. It's like, good, they're here because they're going to help us understand where we are. And so you won't get with FDA, you get the letter, you're in substantial compliance. So what does that mean? You're in substantial, but when CMMI comes and says that you're capable of doing this work that you have, that you're chartered to do, it's a completely different feel, and I believe across the industry we will change our mindset and to the benefit of the patients, which is why we're here.
Okay, thank you, Luann. Appreciate that. Bill, you want to add to that?
Sure. There's at its most basic level, this is about the evolution of our ecosystem into maturity. And so many things have been said. It's about how do we improve patient care. It doesn't happen one element at a time. It's not the company that does it. It's not just the hospital. It's not just FDA. It's all of us. That comes along with the transparency that comes with maturity. You know, with all the disparate sets of metrics, we don't have clarity now. It's very hard to make improvements without growing along this curve, this maturity curve. And as we work together on this, we're going to advance healthcare. We're going to advance every aspect of patient care. It's very critical. It really is a no-brainer to participate in this. Benchmarking is hard, and this just makes it so much easier.
Mm-hmm. Oh, understood. I mean, and Stryker, we've talked about this in other meetings, and Medtronic and Edwards and all the manufacturers, and I just opine on this just for a second on the benchmarking piece. All of us have had benchmarking tools that we've used, either internally created by ourselves. We've used professional services organizations, and in doing that, the key difference, and this went back to a lot, Robin, you remember, and Sean, back when we were doing the change adoption plan, a lot of discussions around the FDA, like why one model? Why can't we just have any model being used and FDA would be happy with that? It's the fact that we all align to one. And that way it's apples to apples. And not only one, but one that's flexible that could be used across small, medium, and large organizations because we all operate differently. And so that was just a key decision point that we had, and it went roundabout for a bit and saying, do we have it, do we not? And then we finally got everybody aligned to say, yeah, we do need the one. We want to be able to empower organizations that can look at a benchmark and say, yeah, this is where we're at, this is our level of maturity, and it's being assessed the same way with the same set of standards that everyone else is within the industry. Nathan, I'll give you an opportunity too.
Yeah, you know, you took a few of the words out of my mouth there, because I think that's how I think about this. Is industry standard stops being a tool that's used against the industry and starts becoming something that's collaborative And it's an objective measurement that we're all able to benchmark and work towards. And it allows us to, maybe not offense and defense is probably not a good analogy for this, but it allows us to proactively see continuous improvement as opposed to being constantly worried about the things that we're not doing. And you know, this is an opportunity to truly shape the industry. And your initial question was, how would you sell this to your C-suite? That's how I'd sell it. This is an industry-shaping opportunity. When I talk to my family or my friends about what I'm doing here in DC today, I tell them that I'm a part of a program that could help accelerate healthcare opportunities to the American public. And that's really what we're doing here. We're putting together some policies that are really going to change the way medicine is practiced in this country probably for decades.
Thank you. So a follow-on question I have, again, back to the manufacturers here, are some of the challenges that you foresee in being able to adopt this voluntary program. I mean, it's not going to be overnight and snap your fingers, and as you know, Luann, you mentioned before around just the cultural piece of this. But I also want to give each of you an opportunity just to talk about some of the challenges that are kind of forefront in your minds and some of the thoughts on how you're going to address those challenges.
So we heard a bit about the first challenge before. Everyone talked about the financials, and it really is always about the opportunity cost and what's the best way to take your scarce resources and drive them. So we're really going to be watching very carefully the details of the program and figuring out, does it make good sense for us to invest here or other quality improvement activities? And that's probably the largest challenge, is how does the detail balance out in the long run?
Yeah. Thank you.
I would say a second challenge is the trust. And do we really believe that industry can change? Do we really believe that FDA can change? And soon we'll let Robin talk, but you know, do we really believe? And I'll tell you, within my company, vice presidents of quality say to me, Luann, I don't believe this can happen. And so it's sort of the elephant in the room, and we just have to head it off at every chance. And when we see something that makes us think that we can't trust each other, we just have to nip it in the bud and be transparent about it, candid, and bring it up.
Yeah, no, thank you, Luann. So, Robin, jumping to you, and certainly echoing what Luann said before, your enthusiasm is contagious. It was great, you know, sitting in the back of the room and kind of seeing you up here, and then I also got to kind of scan the room and see everybody so engaged, also sharing in that enthusiasm of where we are today versus conceptually maybe where we are, you know, kind of 2 years ago on the journey. But turning to you, can you talk about a little bit on the voluntary program, kind of building on your comments earlier, and how this integrates to your compliance strategy?
So if you think about one of the last slides when I put up when I said it's all connected, think about some of the things the agency is doing. Putting the patient first, patient-centric thinking is basically at the core of our strategy. And so everything that we're doing right now at CDRH drives to that particular goal. Think about benefit risk, post-market benefit risk, the idea that I would leave a, frankly, violative product on the market because that made the most sense for patients. We'd manage the risk, we'd mitigate the risk, we'd do what we could, but that actually would make the most sense for patients. Whoa, that would have never happened before. So to your point, and trust, we're already changing. We're already behaving differently because of this basic strategic perspective. Benefit case for quality is another example. The types of gives and changes that we're talking about would have never occurred. I couldn't even have imagined them when I was a VPQ or a regulatory person in the past, but they are happening. They're happening today. And they're happening, this is the really exciting part to me, they're happening with the full 100% support of our center director, actually driven by the vision of our center director. That's remarkable to me. So everything that we're doing right now, all of these pieces that are coming together, if you will, are all driving toward that patient-centric thinking and that strategy, that perspective, putting patient first. And the interesting thing, you were talking about quality. When I talk to industry about quality, when I talk inside the FDA about quality, I define quality as how the patient is experiencing your products. So it's really not about compliance at all. It's about how the patient is experiencing your products. And that is changing everything we do. Think about what's happened in ORA. ORA has completely restructured themselves, and we've got Christina over here who could talk about that, where we have now a device cadre that stands up, and that they are specialists in there. How is that going to improve our ability? Again, it's actually a very patient-centric thing to do, because it says that when the person comes in to do an evaluation of your facility, they're going to get someone who actually knows about devices. They're a specialist in that space, and they actually can be much more facilitative in making sure the right outcome occurs.
Wow. So, I mean, just to reiterate, I mean, that was profound, what you said about viewing quality as a patient experience versus a CFR.
Right.
Because every compliance person I've ever talked to prior to this initiative would have been, gospel and verse of the part. And how you're not meeting it, or how I don't think you're meeting it, and being able to go through that. So, so certainly appreciate those thoughts, Robin, on that. Kind of building on, again, all the changes that are going on internally within FDA. If you maybe share, again, a bit more just how does this work with all of the other strategic priorities and everything going on that FDA is really transforming internally?
I talked to you a little bit about the fact that we're going to be structurally very different in the future. That the purpose of Total Product Lifecycle Organization is to give us, I think, the right framework to be as thoughtful as possible about every decision that we make. Now, don't get me wrong, it's a bit of a list. So because we're spending a lot of hours, and Sean and Cisco, these guys can tell you, we're probably spending 3 meetings a day sometimes in that TPLC environment, trying to plan, think about how we work together, think about how we work differently. But part of every one of those conversations, interestingly enough, is kind of an undertone that speaks to how are we making it better? How are we becoming more patient-centric? How does this structure play to our ability to share information across the organization so that the company knows what the company knows, so that we can make really informed decisions? So, in fact, it's a common thing when people try to throw up, here's a potential org chart. They put it up and we go, okay, how does that solve the problem? Because the problem is really what matters. We need to be able to make the most patient-centric and comprehensive decisions possible, utilizing the broadest amount of data and knowledge that we have available to us. How do we achieve that? So this is happening, and it's hard, but it's exciting at the same time.
Great. Thank you, Robin. Appreciate that. So we have a couple of minutes. I wanted to open up to the audience, both who's in the room here and then also online, to ask the panel some questions. Stephanie, you can grab some microphones. Yeah.
Actually, it's a little bit less of a question, but more to address Luann. And Robin, you just answered it very well, but I just wanted to give a little bit of perspective of it. I met Dr. Sherman in 2011 when he was just starting to talk about a center of innovation and some of his vision to an audience that was, shall we just say, less than receptive. But I got up and I said I'd like to be part of it. And he invited me in to be as the EAR, and just even seeing the difference internally in FDA then, and systematically, and even with Bill Murray on the other side of the podium there, the fact that the trust has been building, and has been building with every step of the way. And I think that that also reflects a part of the CMMI process, where it really is a grassroots to build, and it's not going to be something where all of a sudden you have an appraisal and wow, boom, you're great. It's part of the process. It's part of improving, and part of also innovation, and bringing that whole cycle and the mindset that's a cycle into how we move forward. So just a comment, not a question.
Thank you, Visma. Oh, yeah, question over here.
So Luann had talked about value-based healthcare. We heard about quality-based purchasing. I'm interested in engagements, dialogues with CMS and private payers that anyone may be having, in actually looking at opportunities to use the real-world outcomes data to help change reimbursement models, and looking at moving away from fee-for-service to enable some of the value-based healthcare propositions, specifically in cases where the best clinical outcome are those that are in long duration and often conflict with the fee-for-service reimbursement model.
I would like to.
I mean, I can say a little bit more about what we're trying to work with in terms of Avalier around the value-based frameworks. And so Avalier underwent, along with Faster Cures and others, a process of trying to build out what would it look like if you had patient perspectives taken into account in the value frameworks. And so, you know, some of that information, there's actually, so if you go to either our website or Avalier's website and put in PPVF, you can find the value-based framework there. I actually thought about bringing them, but I didn't. But we have a first version of that, and I guess the points to highlight in that have to do with saying that there are certain patient outcomes that are becoming more routinely collected and could also be more routinely collected. Patient-reported outcomes, some patient preference data, certainly risk and benefit assessment data that could be taken into account in the value frameworks. And then there's also the issue of patient out-of-pocket costs. Now, we know from a lot of survey data that patient out-of-pocket costs aren't actually their primary concern. They want the outcomes. They want to return to a new normal, or they want some other kind of quality outcome for themselves. And that cost isn't a major factor, but it is a factor. And when we put this, we put this out to the public for public comment. We received about over 100 public comments on the framework. And one of the things we consistently heard from patients was, you know, if I didn't realize when I was diagnosed that I would have to deal with all of this that's on the sheet, but you hit all the things that I have to deal with. And so they almost wanted our framework to become an educational tool for them to sort of say, this is what all the stuff that you have to deal with when you get diagnosed, and this is how the system deals with it. Again, back to that transparency point I was making earlier. So I think that it's still an open question about how any value framework is going to operate in this new system, but we are interacting with all the other value framework folks to sort of see, and they're very interested in saying, okay, how do we take into account the patient perspective into our thinking? And now I think where the rubber meets the road and where the real challenge is making sure that the data is of a good, sufficient quality and sufficient variety to cover those things that matter to patients, and in such a way that the system can take it into account and use it in decision making.
I appreciate that, Cindy. Just a little follow-up there. Any discussion in terms of any impact from a macro perspective that you think has on that value-based framework and being able to tie to better outcomes? So, Mike, kind of building on what you said earlier, you know, first the decision was really on cost in some respects. Now if it goes to value, and if value of using this device has a preferred outcome, and now I'm as a physician being able to use better devices which have a better outcome, again, with MACRA now, there's changes happening in terms of incentives-based payments. Any discussions that you've been a part of that brought that up already?
Well, I can just say, so not deeply, but I would say that, you know, the thing that we consistently hear from patients or from providers with regard to patient-reported outcomes specifically, and those are those measures, those very technical measures about fatigue or a pain, is that one of the challenges that providers have said to us is we don't know if we can be held accountable on those kinds of measures because there's so many other things that go into that beyond what I have control over. And so I think that's a general issue that we're going to have to wrestle with in terms of any kind of, you know, reimbursement or even incentive for providers in terms of providing care. What are they held accountable for around the outcomes that we're measuring, and what do we feel like we could say is some sort of shared accountability? And it sounds like you're also trying to deal with that in your program around taking some accountability for your product.
Right, because everyone has an accountability, but it just doesn't add up to what the patient needs. And so when the provider says, well, I just put the device in, and the device maker says, well, I just give them the device, there's so much more to it. Probably you may be able to comment, Bill, on some of the bundle activity that's coming out of CMS for your products, where if the hospital gets one payment, and that's all they get, and if it costs more, then the hospital has to absorb that. And so hospitals are saying, all right, there are a number of things that I can do to enhance the quality of the service that I provide. And it's not just the device, it's the patient who comes to the door. If the patient is overweight, then some hospitals are saying, go lose weight before we put this device in you because your BMI is too high. The likelihood of success is low. If you're borderline diabetic, your A1Cs are too high, go get that under control because you're more likely to have an infection before we give you this hip. And so that's changing the world right now, this bundle thing coming out of CMS, which is just interesting. Have you had experiences with it?
So it's really hard to add anything to what you said. It's going to create efficiencies across. Yeah, I know. No, you did a great job, Lynn. It's driving efficiencies across how we deal with the patient, how the facilities deal with the physicians, how the care is delivered, and the choice of product. It's the full spectrum.
Thank you, Bill. Bill?
Yeah, just to add on to this, this is one of the reasons why NEST is so strategically important, because we're talking about if you will, decentralized federated data sources that ultimately have to align to achieve these metrics. And so without that, it's hard for anybody within the value system to feel comfortable with a risk-based decision because they're not comfortable or don't know what the other risk parameters are in that process. We do have within the NEST construct on the governing committee both private payers representation as well as CMS. So it's going to be a journey, and it's not something that's going to be addressed quickly, but it's a recognition that that stakeholder community within the ecosystem is going to have to be part of this equation as well.
If I could just add one thing to that, this is Karen on this end. So I can speak just very briefly and make just a couple of comments from the pre-market side and how we view patient-reported outcomes and patient preferences. So two very different things, but as you heard from our strategic priority and you may be aware of, I'm certain you are aware of it, is related to being able to encourage, one of our largest efforts is to reach out to these patient communities so that we can see more of gathering of patient preference and patient-reported outcomes. One of the real problems is that some of these validated tools, let's say in the space of patient-reported outcomes, quality of life measures, for example, there are some really, very debilitating diseases, like I'll say chronic debilitating heart failure, maybe a class 4 patient. This is data that's really important when you want to approve your device, or these are endpoints. These are endpoints. We have approved devices in these really, really sick patients based on endpoints that were considered soft and qualitative data, patient-reported outcomes. But CMS is very interested in that. They are very interested, and they've told us that. They're very interested in maybe the patient didn't live longer, but they felt better with this particular device. And we are open to, adding this to labeling. So you add it to labeling. That's not to say, you're more likely to get your device reimbursed over another in the same class, but it's an early introduction into their advantages to certain devices with data that actually supported that. There's scientific evidence to say, and that's why it's part of the labeling.
If I may, I think that's right on. I think many of our lives have been touched by somebody going through cancer, for example. And I mean, at least in my experiences, I've seen a big shift from people saying, yeah, I want more years, to I want more quality years. And sometimes the treatment is worse than the drug. And so those softer measures are becoming so much more important. From an industry side, I think we're going to see more and more shifts for how industries own that accountability on the quality of life or on procedural success rates. So we're going to see sales reps, for example, compensated differently, compensated based on the success of the procedure or the outcome to the patient, not just on the sale of the product. I know we're seeing that shifting occurring in our organization, and I wouldn't be surprised if other organizations see that similar shift.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that I think FDA as an organization, is a leader in this effort and not a follower. And I think that's a really, I know that's been said, but just from the patient community and from the stakeholders that we work with, and how receptive all of FDA has been around this issue has just been remarkable. And without that, this really would have been a hold hands in a circle and sing Kumbaya, and we would have gotten nowhere. But with your point about the willingness to sort of think creatively about how to collect the data in a meaningful way and use it in labels or use it in some way of communicating to patients and providers in the system what outcomes patients can expect, and then help them input that into their shared decision-making with their provider to say, what are the outcomes that are most important to me, and how can I achieve those? So just hat tip to all of FDA for that.
Thank you, Robin.
Cisco?
So actually, Cindy, I had a question maybe for you, and not that you need to have an answer, but maybe if you've got some general thoughts on it. I liked and appreciated a lot of what you discussed in terms of the transparency, right? How do we build that trust across all the levels? With the work that's going on in, at least from the maturity standpoint, the organizational excellence pieces in case for quality, one of the things, at least personally, that I've had a struggle with is how do I get the visibility when we're talking about really that far leading down the product development cycle, that change? What is it that the patient would want to see that would help enable some of that trust?
That's a really good question. So I think at the very basic individual patient level, what we hear is that I want to understand why you're collecting the information you're collecting from me, what you're going to do with it, and what my access to it is. And so that's that individual. So if you're going to give me a patient-reported outcome measure and you want me to fill out this survey about my pain, why do you care about my pain? Is that going to make better care for me? What are you going to do for me with that pain information? And by the way, can I have access to that because I'm going to fill it out in 6 months and I wanted to see what my baseline was and how it's changed for me as well. What did I say before? So that's at the individual level. I don't exactly have great answers to how to ladder that up to the population or system level, and I think that's a real struggle with any information that you're going to collect about patients that's useful to them. It's easier to think about it in my own individual circumstance with my provider than it is as a system, right? But I do think that there's a lot of assumptions that patients make about how their data is used and shared. So for example, when I participate in a clinical trial, I will assume that you are sharing that data, and you are not often sharing that data. And so that is an assumption that's made, and now we are disabused of that assumption as patients, and so then, and as participants in the clinical trial, and so then what does that mean? Those kinds of lack of transparency erodes trust, and so some way of communicating how the system is using their information is a critical piece. It's a gap that Faster Cures has identified and all of our stakeholders that we're working with, and so we're trying to think about innovative ways to fill that educational gap. Other organizations, National Health Council is too. But I think it's incumbent upon everybody in the system to try to think, how am I communicating about the information, the patient-related information that I'm using, and how I'm making decisions with it, and what's the broadest way that I can communicate that, just to at least make it less of a black box for patients.
Mike and I were actually talking about this a little earlier. You know, if you look at the panel, we have manufacturers, we have providers, we have the patient represented and regulators and so on, but the payers aren't here. And I can tell you from personal experience, I happen to know somebody who had rotator cuff surgery. And I can tell you what anchors were used, what sutures were used, what endoscopes, and so on and so forth. And the surgeon did a wonderful job, and everything was great, and the pain management was awesome. But then 2 visits into PT, the insurance company said, you've reached your limit on PT. And then you have to climb the mountains of no's because, hey, your limit is 30, and you did 28 before surgery to try to prevent surgery, right? So then you're at the point where we had great devices being used, we had great physicians, great organizations, great so on and so forth, And the even more interesting thing is if this person needed a follow-up surgery because her shoulder froze again, they would pay for the new surgery. They would not pay for the PT. So the point is we need to look at this holistically, and we need to figure out how do we bundle things so that, you know, to both of your points earlier, if you're paying for a procedure, you're actually paying for the outcome of that procedure, not just that when you left the hospital, you achieved the goal that you came into the hospital with. It's, I want full mobility. I don't want just my shoulder to be fixed.
Yeah, no, Dan, great point. And again, I think that goes to the ecosystem that we talked about, and it continues to expand. And I think it's amazing from where we go, where we were before, where it was much more manufacturing centric, to now we're expanding out. But excellent point. We've got time for one more question, if we have it. Yeah, Robbie.
So I just wanted to further underscore Dan's point. It's funny, I was actually talking to a friend who has a company that's basically doing artificial intelligence on the financial side, and I was drawing parallels to what you were just talking about. I think the point was that somehow in the traditional financial model, everybody thought risk was standard deviation of returns. Turns out it's a lot more than that. And in our case, we've got outcomes. And I think we've done a very nice job of discussing those. I think somehow we've got to correlate that outcome to the performance of the device. Because in the example that Dan just gave, it was really the lack of physiotherapy that should have been given that was not approved for whatever reason. You could have had the best clamps and the best screws and the best studs and everything else in there, you could still have bad outcomes. So somehow you've got to relate the outcome to the quality of the performance of the device in some way to make sense out of this. Because there's a lot of data out there, not enough filters, and not enough structure around the data for us to be able to compare apples to apples.
No, thank you, Rob.
Just a comment.
No, appreciate the comment. Any final thoughts from the panel on that? All right. Well, then, oh, you going to?
Well, I was just going to say on that data front, I do think that the better uses of the data that we have, we're going to be just ever more inundated with data. And I think trying to really sort through as an ecosystem what the quality of the data is and how to use it in decision making is absolutely where every organization is going to have to be. And it's going to, by definition, mean a de-siloed approach.
Very good. Thank you, panel. If you guys just have everyone a round of applause for our panel. It's very insightful. Thank you.
All right, well, I want to add my thanks to the panel. That was a terrific way for us to kind of bring together a lot of the players that are represented here at MDIC and have that, continue that discussion on the value of the quality program that we're looking to build. One of the really exciting things that I think we do at these forums